So welcome to our next session on envisioning an inclusive net zero future. The environment and future sustainability, as we know, are core issues to our current and future existence. And they're really important parts to policy priorities. But so is inclusivity. And so we have here today with us an amazing panel. I'm so glad you all could make it and you want to engage with us on this, on really reflecting on how you balance those different priorities. How can this be an and conversation rather than an or conversation? So to lead us in this conversation, we're grateful to have with us John McArthur. He's also a member of Policy Horizons Deputy Minister Steering Committee. He's also, of course, the Senior Fellow and the inaugural Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings Institution, where he co-founded and he co-chairs the 17 Rooms Initiative for the Sustainable Development Goals. John also happens to be a Canadian from Vancouver, where he grew up. So that's an additional Canadian link there. But thank you very much, John, for being with us here again this year to hold this conversation. Let me turn the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Merci, Christelle. Et bonjour tout le monde. Ça me fait tellement plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. Comme on vient de discuter, je suis Canadien, bien sûr, mais c'est une conversation aujourd'hui globale. Alors, on va continuer en anglais, mais si quelqu'un veut continuer en français, on va ajouter les deux langues officielles comme on a la traduction aujourd'hui. Alors, merci. Mais let's jump in to introduce our panelists. We have an extraordinary range of perspectives here. Just to introduce them alphabetically, we have Catherine Abreu, who is the founder and executive director of Destination Zero and a member of Canada's Net Zero Advisory Board. We have Dr. Romina Boarini, who's the director of the Center for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity, or WISE, at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, based in Paris. We have Jomo Kwame Sundaram, or Jomo, who is a longstanding global leader on the issues of economic development, sustainability, and inclusion. He's a senior advisor at the Khazanah Research Institute, based in Malaysia, being very gracious to stay up quite late to join us today. But he is also a former senior UN official at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and also the Food and Agricultural Organization, where he was chief economist, and a longstanding leader of voices from the Global South and helping to cut through some of the maybe misplaced nostrums of global debates at various times, and a former colleague and collaborator and even debater in different stages. So delighted to have him back here today. And then last but certainly not least, Eriel Tchekwie Deranger, who's the executive director of Indigenous Climate Action. And so we are here today to talk about the challenges of net zero and inclusive transitions. We couldn't ask for a better panel of perspectives from Canada, from the global conversation, and from different parts of the world. And I was asked just to share a few framing comments on this. As a Canadian who follows quite closely the Canadian debates, but also who lives in the middle of many of the international debates. And one of the things I think that's very important to stress is the challenge of net zero is, of course, a global challenge. But in my experience in Canada, we're not discussing it globally enough. We have responsibilities at home, which are crucial, but we also have to help the rest of the world succeed on its path to net zero, which I think we're often underestimating. There is what I would call a domestic debate, which ultimately boils down to a progressive view of government action on a public goods problem, to ultimately a libertarian view on a let markets and technology drive the way. There's, at a deeper level, an impasse globally around a legacy, not just of who caused the problem, but what's the actual problem we're trying to solve. For so many countries that are facing deep challenges of poverty and prosperity, this is a first order issue of how to have inclusive prosperity while tackling a problem that maybe has a legacy of who actually caused it in the first place. Crucially, there's huge variation in the different types of issues countries face, whether it's a small island developing state that is worried about sea level rise and its even existence as a nation in the future, to a coal-dependent economy that might be grappling with poverty and have no alternative sources of energy at a low cost and no help from the international community to finance the transition. And then crucially, there's so many poor countries, and we've seen it time and again, whereas the richest countries in the world have had access to near infinite financing to tackle their crises, the emerging economies have so little access to financing and often are excluded from access to financing to tackle their challenges. In my view, and we're working with colleagues to elevate perspectives, green transitions comes down to 3 parts: an energy transition, a just transition. Second, it requires an emphasis on resilience and adaptation, whatever that means for a community to succeed. And third, it needs some basic investments in natural capital as an essential ingredient for a way forward. All of this has to be done in an inclusive way, and all of it has to be done in a way that helps communities succeed on their terms. So that's just my own framing view. Others will have their own views and share their own, hopefully, competing thoughts, and even elevate the conversation with better thoughts on how we can think about moving forward. I wanted to start with Eriel, who, as mentioned, is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Climate Action Network. And Eriel, you, of course, come at this from so many relevant views on how communities in Canada confront this issue, and would love to hear from you on what's your take on the biggest impediments to progress for moving forward.
Just starting off with a light question for a Monday morning or Tuesday morning. Thank you so much. So, iklanate dene sotlaneta Eriel Tchekwie hushe Deranger betsini hasli. So I just introduced myself in my language, which is dene sotlane. It's just a practice that I try to take on. I think this is a really, really interesting topic. When we talk about impediments to climate action, sustainability, and achieving the goals that we all have collectively to address the climate crisis, that is the key, all. The problem that we are seeing is that there continues to be an exclusion and a marginalization of solutions outside of the sort of prescribed colonial Western modalities and imperial data collection on how to address the climate crisis. We have degraded the climate crisis to a mathematical equation to be solved by trying to equalize numbers in spreadsheets rather than including and diversifying and expanding the solutions outside of those systems. And these are the very systems that have gotten us into the climate crisis to begin with. At Indigenous Climate Action, we have been working with communities to unpack not just climate change, but how colonization, white supremacy, and systems of oppression have contributed to the very crisis that we're in. And within this scope, we are looking at what would it mean to decolonize climate policy and climate action. And this requires a major undoing of the systems that are in place. And I think that that is one of the biggest impediments, that we are holding on with all of the energy that we have to the very structures. We're trying to fix these systems that have fundamentally created an imbalance on this planet. For many of the communities that we have worked with, when we ask them, when was the first time you started to witness and or experience climate change in your lands and territories, it is always some of the eldest peoples in the communities, our elders that have witnessed the changes on the lands over the time, that have said, colonization is when climate change started for us. This is when the land began to change. And so when we talk about these impediments, it's the idea that there is good data and bad data, something that's relevant or irrelevant. And the stories and the Indigenous knowledge of our communities continues to be treated as anecdotal rather than critical. And I want to share this really quick story before we move forward, because when we narrow the scope of what solutions look like and the data that can include the solutions, there are major problems that can happen. There are major areas of solutions that get excluded. in my community in between 2009 to 2012 in the lower Athabasca region, they were working on a surface water quantity framework. And the government hired their best hydrologists, biologists, ecologists to study the ecosystems to determine what a base ecosystem flow would be. And they didn't include Indigenous knowledge into those studies at all. And when they presented their final data of an ecological base flow that balanced the needs of nature and the needs of industry, because I come from an oil sands rich region, they presented their findings to our community, and our community didn't understand it. It was some 100 cubic meters per second flow rate. And when they took the scientists out to the land and they showed them the actual tangible flow rates of what that would mean in a vessel in the water, and they went to all the pinch points for hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, spiritual grounds, burial grounds, they started to understand the flow rate. And for the most part, it was okay. There was a couple areas it wasn't so great. But a land user and a hunter that hunts traditional food to still continue to feed the community, where the price of food is extraordinarily high and country foods are essential, he said, what happens if I get a bull moose and put it in my boat? Am I still going to be able to traverse back home? And in actuality, he was not able to. And this equated to doubling the ecological base flow that the government and these ecologists and hydrologists had said was going to be necessary to maintain and protect the ecology. What happened was we excluded humanity. We excluded Indigenous interactions with ecosystems as if it was an externality. And we have to start looking at what our relationships are with the lands and the ecosystems. Otherwise, we're going to continue to miss these points. And now we have stronger surface water quantity frameworks in the province of Alberta because of Indigenous knowledge that has continued to be left out of the conversations when we develop scientific data and policies and measures. We must move forward to expand our horizons of what Indigenous climate action, sustainability, and goals can look like. If we don't, we are in danger and risking replicating those very systems of harm that have marginalized our peoples for hundreds of years and since colonization. I really think that we have such a beautiful way to move forward, but we must expand. We cannot and can no longer just continue to build solutions within a narrow framework of the context of Western empirical data and science. We must include Indigenous rights and knowledge systems.
Thank you so much, Eriel. I really appreciate that. Ground truthing, if you will. Catherine, what do you see? And I know we only have so much time here today. We only have 44 minutes left to hear from all of you on lots of things, but maybe Catherine, what do you see as impediments and maybe opportunities as well? I think we heard a bit of both from Eriel there. What do you see as the real frontier for Canada and in the world?
So, thanks so much to the conference organizers for having me. It's great to be here with y'all today. And so happy that we started with Eriel, because I think that you really nailed it on the head, Eriel. One of our biggest impediments to effective action on climate change is what we count as relevant to the conversation about climate change and what we exclude from that conversation. And so I'm going to focus my comments on impediments and opportunities to kind of three areas that unpack that in my mind. Number one, for me, the obvious biggest impediment to action on climate change is fossil fuels. Our dependence on fossil fuels, the extent to which our societies are built on infrastructure that are predicated on the combustion of fossil fuels. So this incredible inertia in our infrastructural systems and the very ways that our communities are built and the ways that we live in our communities. The incredible power, wealth, and influence of the fossil fuel industry that up until very recently was the most powerful and wealthiest industry to ever exist on the face of the planet before the Bezos of the world took over. And the capture that the fossil fuel industry, its power and its wealth and its influence has on political decision makers, which I think we see play out here in Canada across political spaces pretty regularly. And so unpacking that, I think, is a huge opportunity. Because if we start to really unwind ourselves from fossil fuel dependence, then we start to ask some really important questions. And that leads me to my two other points. The first important question is a question of who benefits. If we start to ask who benefits from the current energy system as they stand, and the ways in which those energy systems influence our communities, our workplaces, then we start to see, oh, okay, the benefit of status quo energy systems is really concentrated in the hands of wealthy and powerful people, does not get distributed equally amongst communities. There are a bunch of people who are left out of that benefit equation. And indeed, we find those status quo energy systems aren't working for the planet, they're not working for people. And that gives us the opportunity to say, okay, as we transition to other energy systems, we get the opportunity to decide who benefits from those. And from my perspective, we should be actively deciding that those communities that have been left out of the status quo energy system are on the forefront of benefiting from that energy system, from new energy systems. So a good example of this in Canada is the fact that up to 20% of renewable energy projects in this country are owned and operated by Indigenous communities, and that number is growing regularly. Indigenous communities that have, up until now, largely been dependent on extremely expensive and polluting sources of energy like diesel, are gaining autonomy, energy autonomy, and prosperity and new job opportunities by moving to renewable energy. And we should be thinking about how we expand the creation of those opportunities in the energy transition. And then finally, my third point, the question that it begs as we think through how we move away from fossil fuel dependence is how we move from incremental change to structural change. And Eriel was really getting at this in her comments as well. For over 30 years of climate action, we have been stuck in an incremental change framework. We're tinkering around on the edges of the existing system and trying to make it better. Clearly that hasn't worked. And from my perspective, that invites us into the acknowledgement of the fact that this is a struggle that is going to require deep structural changes across our society and economies. And ultimately, climate change itself is a systemic problem. It is changing the systems that we live in and work with. And so it requires systemic solutions. And I will leave it there to hear from our other panelists.
Thank you so much. The fossil fuel backdrop certainly is the definition of the problem, if you will. And then and it's so deep, and then asking who benefits and who needs to benefit, and then how to be more structural in a non-linear way, if you will, is I think part of the deep question here. Jomo, maybe turning to you, you're of course a PhD economist with a lot of backgrounds in numbers, but you've also we've heard the critique of an overly arithmetic approach here, but you're also very, I think, sensitive to the community level politics that define so many communities' approaches to success or to problems. I'm curious what you see, if you want to comment on what you've heard so far, or even just add your own views, of course, from your own perspective on what are these big impediments and opportunities.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the organizers for kindly inviting me to join you today. My task is made easier by the preceding comments, not only the framing comments from you, John, but also the comments from Eriel as well as Catherine. Nonetheless, I'd like to make 5 comments, if I may, very quickly. Firstly, I think it is important to recognize that net zero is simply not enough. If one refers to the latest IPCC report, certainly net zero is not going to get us very far, considering that it is meant for the year 2050. And this has been the way governments particularly have framed the objectives. And this is certainly not enough by any stretch of the imagination. Secondly, there is a problem of time. The fact that it allows us to frame the whole issue of achieving a target almost 3 decades from now allows a lot of kicking the can down the road. You don't have a sense of urgency. There's no need to act immediately. There's no need to do very much right away. And this, I think, is an important problem. Thirdly, there's a big problem that it is very unlikely to be achieved, simply because there is so much, just defining a global objective of net zero and presuming that everybody will be on board ignores the fact that there are a whole range of problems involved. We have the recent experience of a president of the largest emitting country, basically withdrawing from an agreement, and an increasing likelihood that he may actually get re-elected. We have governments in Europe as well as elsewhere, which have also do not accept any kind of binding commitment, let alone the non-binding Paris Declaration. It is good, for example, that the Australian government, the largest emitter among OECD countries, has recently changed the government. But we also know how difficult it has been for past Labour governments to move very far in Australia, given the nature of Australian society, given the nature of Australian economy, and so on and so forth. So the fact that there is so much what economists and others like to call free riding is a huge problem. The fourth problem is something you hinted at, John, and that is a question, and Eriel as well, the gross inequalities which are involved. The inequalities involved in emissions over the last 2 centuries, and particularly now, the inequalities involved in terms of the impact. The tropical zone, for instance, is experiencing tremendous impacts from global warming. It will take far too long to get into the details of that, and so it will get very, very little comfort from the long duration envisaged. And the last point I'd like to make is that a lot of the discussion, unfortunately, has been framed primarily in terms of corporate solutions. I'm not suggesting that the private sector does not have an important role to play. Obviously, it does. But the fact of the matter remains that solutions are defined primarily in terms of what corporations can do, so what agribusiness, for instance, can do, and so on and so forth. And this is a very fundamental problem because we know how little commitment there has been, despite a great deal of ESG and other types of posturing which have been going on. Let me stop here so that we can have a debate on some of these important issues. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Jomo. The adequacy of the objective, the speed, the timing, the likelihood, and who has to act, I think is really a deep point there. Romina, you approach this from the OECD, which is, of course, a membership-based organization of mostly advanced economies, so-called, with all caveats to what that term means, duly noted. But I'm curious from your perspective, working at these interface of inclusion, sustainability, and you used to work a lot on inclusive growth questions, which has been a major topic in Canada, of course. How do you see this set of impediments and opportunities, and are there things Canadians can learn from how other so-called peer countries are grappling with some of these problems?
Well, thanks for the question. Of course, what I just heard from the other speakers is so inspiring that I almost tempted, to just, build on what they just shared. But maybe what I'll stress to start with is the fact that, we really look at these issues of equity or lack of equity and the need to combat climate change, in a very, very joint fashion. You rightly said that the OECD looked a lot into the issues of inclusive growth, and that was, essentially because in all OECD countries we did observe the rise of inequalities in the last 20 years, mainly, I would say, let's say starting with the 90s until the great financial recessions, and things after that, I think, became a little bit better. Although the issue is still that the inequalities that exist today are very, very large, so they're still kind of record high. They are still not just economic in nature. So in all well-being domains we look at, we see a lot of sort of inequalities
and those inequalities get transmitted. So, you know, we really got concerned about these issues. And at the same time, of course, we were increasingly get worried about, you know, the climate change and, you know, the many other sort of issues with degradations and degradations of the planet. And so I think it became very apparent to us that we couldn't, you know, just look at the two things separately. And we started a lot this relationship between inequalities and environment. And actually, some have already mentioned the fact that sort of the benefits of inaction are concentrated. But what we have documented is that actually the cost of inaction is concentrated too. And so indeed, you know, as Jomo was mentioning, if you look at you know, what is suffering most, and again, in terms of health, physical health, mental health, but also in terms of lack of income, lack of productivity, from the growing climate change and from the inaction or sort of insufficient action on climate change, is actually the most disadvantaged communities. And this is true, in fact, in many OECD countries. And what we have also seen is, you know, the other sort of side of this story is that if you start becoming very ambitious, but also perhaps a little bit traditional on the way you try to fight climate change, and so that actually rejoins a bit what Eriel was saying. So if you try to sort of, in a way, take standard policies, for instance, you start taxing people and with carbon pricing and that sort of things, that can be also very sort of inequality enhancing as opposed to inequality reducing. So in fact, you know, this is all regressive, and so also the cost of action can be really going in the wrong directions. And so the real question is really, how do you make sure that then as you really decarbonize the system as much as you can, you do it in a way that can be fully inclusive for the people that's obviously, and all the communities that are in the planet. So we look a lot at that. And we recently published a report. I'm going to put like the reference in the chat for the ones that are listening to us today. And this is a book that looks at the progress that OECD countries made on SDGs. And obviously SDGs still at the moment is the main blueprint, one that perhaps is still criticized, but still it is, I would say, steering the action and the common positions of many countries, not only OECD, on those issues. And I think the relatively sort of negative finding from this report is that, you know, even OECD countries that in a way are the most developed, you know, the best, I would say, equipped, and you know, the ones that have the greatest tools, you know, to reach SDGs, even those countries really are not doing very greatly, especially actually on issues that relate to inequalities, leaving no one behind, poverty eradication, so inclusion, generally speaking, and everything that connects with climate and other planet goals. So I mean, the progress there is absolutely insufficient to reach the commitments that were adopted by all countries of this world back in 2016. And so really focusing on you know, trying to sort of find approaches for the just transition is absolutely sort of required right now. And so that's where we're trying to sort of you know, focus the energy and the attentions of our countries. Now, in terms of the opportunities, let me start first with a sort of a missed opportunity. The recovery, you know, reconstruction packages that many OECD countries put forward in the wake of the pandemic, and we know that, you know, many of them have been unprecedented. They did, you know, also, I mean, they constituted a possible opportunity, you know, to sort of enhance green policies and decarbonization policies. And yet, when you look at, you know, the type of policies that those that countries, OECD countries, adopted, again, to reconstruct after, or to build back better, as we used to say, only 20% of the spending that were associated with recovery packages actually is considered to be positive for the planet. So it means that the large majority of those spending packages actually were not, you know, going in the directions of decarbonizations, and, you know, in other words, that obviously, you know, means that they still, I mean, those spending packages still consisted of a lot of subsidies being paid to fossil fuel industry. So I think that that's obviously rejoins what others have said. And the other perhaps point to say is that, you know, again, one of the pieces of information we documented in this report on SDGs that we published recently is the fact that, you know, some of the positive progress that OECD countries made on climate and other planet sort of goals was, you know, was actually possible because OECD countries exported some of the emissions and production of emissions in non-OECD countries. So, looking at the questions of how OECD countries are actually acting, I mean, and to what extent their trajectories, to where SDGs are giving a chance or not to non-OECD to also get there, I think really the picture is definitely not a positive one. But there are a number of opportunities there, if I can comment quickly on that. I think there is a large momentum, and I think in many governments still there is a strong recognition, and the OECD of course fosters that approach very much, that much more needs to happen in terms of climate change. So I think we do expect in the OECD to have governments working on very ambitious climate strategies where the issue of equity is one that is going to occupy quite sort of fundamental place. And it's not just in governments. So the OECD works with a lot of private companies and various other stakeholders, investors, etc. I think what we see there is that there are opportunities. I would in particular want to stress what's going on, when it comes to disclosure related sort of initiatives at the moment. There are going to be a few right now, importantly in the US, in Europe, and in other sort of jurisdictions. And we know that those initiatives are going to put the right pressure on investors and on companies to move into the right direction. Of course, the sort of regulation is not out yet, but I think what we have been seeing coming up is something that is relatively encouraging. So there are opportunities there, and I think it is about understanding well, in which concrete ways governments, but also the other stakeholders can join those efforts.
Thank you. It's so interesting to get the broader perspective. Thank you, Romina. And also, I think tying to the Sustainable Development Goal issues, which are something I personally work on quite a bit, and even actually benchmarked how Canada is doing on those issues. And the bottom line is even Canada isn't nearly on track for the vast majority of the goals domestically. Because on each issue, there's some people or place getting left behind. Indigenous and First Nation communities, obviously at the forefront of many of those, but it's not exclusive. It's many other communities getting left behind as well across the country. And I would say many issues getting left behind. And so I'm curious, but I do want to come back and Eriel and maybe Catherine as the domestic experts, if you will, within the Canadian debates on net zero. And maybe I have a slightly different view, so just to service it, Eriel, on what you described. This notion of decolonizing the debate, something I would personally be all for, on all issues and kind of confronting legacy power structures. I can only make the determination on how Canada is doing on these issues by using spreadsheets, by actually tracking the data to say, look at the number of people dying, look at this, even the spreadsheets on Indigenous communities that of course don't have access to drinking water. But my view is not, and you can literally go online to see them. My view is not that we don't need the spreadsheets, but we can't be confined by them. So for me, it's an and, not an or. And I think when we're dealing with the biophysical realities of a global carbon budget, for example, I don't want people to ignore the hard realities of what Jomo was saying or what Catherine was saying, like, this needs to happen immediately, it needs to happen urgently, because the math is what it is. And so I think, I'm wondering how you suggest on a kind of forward-looking basis, feel free to disagree, of course, if you do, that is meant to surface difference of opinion, but if you agree with any of what I just said, how do we make the most of that to be inclusive, not just in the anchoring of testable hypotheses, if you will, of like, is that number true or not, but also the inclusion that's required in order to get a broader sense of the narratives and numbers that really drive societies to succeed. So I'm curious, Eriel and Catherine, how do you think about those tensions?
I think if it's okay, Kat, I'm going to take a stab first at this, just because there were some very direct questions. I think there's there's this sort of misconception and fear really around what decolonizing policies and government and structural systems would really look like. And over the course of the last couple of years, Indigenous Climate Action we've done a report on decolonizing climate policy in Canada, which we're working with our communities to really unpack what that could look like. We're still in that phase of building it, but the consensus around the tables has always been it's not to just like throw everything out the window and start from scratch, but it's drawing on the wisdom and the knowledge that our peoples have in relationship with the lands and ecosystems that helps to draw a more holistic picture of not just the climate crisis, but of pathways and solutions forward. Now, I just want to ensure that we don't get things conflated around decolonization versus indigenizing, because this is a big problem that we're seeing right now. Within the structures of how we achieve, just transition and climate justice, there's been this peppering of Indigenous throughout Canada's climate policies and plans and actions and frameworks without any substantive processes or steps as to how they actually achieve the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge systems alongside the empirical data, which, as you said, is critical. It's important. It does help paint the picture, but it doesn't paint the whole picture. We have narrowed our scope to such a very small definition of what the climate crisis looks like from a mathematical equation to the solutions that pair alongside that. And we have to broaden those scopes. And when we start to broaden those scopes, it's like, what does that look like? I think there's some really interesting pieces. So decolonizing versus indigenizing first, I want to address that. Indigenizing is just creating visibility of. It's like diversity and inclusion. It sounds great, but diversity, inclusion, and transformation are much different. We need to move towards how we deconstruct the systems that created those systems of oppression to allow room for more. That's decolonization. It's addressing power, resources, access to decision making, not just pulling a seat up to an already existing infrastructure and table, but allowing that table to bend and move, and for things to be removed and for new things to be added. So kind of taking the spreadsheet and broadening the scope of what kind of data gets input into it. That's very complicated. I think secondarily, we also have to look at how those solutions have already been brought forward. Indigenous Climate Action also released a report, co-released a report last year called Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon, which calculated Indigenous resistance, where Indigenous peoples have been criminalized for protecting and standing up against corporations that want to take our lands and territories to expand and continue the fossil fuel regime. And what we found across Turtle Island or North America is that Indigenous struggles where they have been criminalized, policed, heavily incarcerated in many cases, it accounts to 1.8 billion metric tons of carbon that has either been delayed or continues to remain in the land. And so we start to see how Indigenous resistance to the continuation of the fossil fuel system is critical, but without infrastructure that protects Indigenous rights and includes free, prior, informed consent and the inclusion of our rights to a title of ownership and control over our lands and territories, we're going to continue to see this discrepancy and oppression. And lastly, within that context, I also want to state that when we move towards looking at ways that continue to have a scope within carbon essentialism, and we talk about decarbonization, we're starting to see this idea of how do we protect the land, which is absolutely critical. Indigenous people share this value, but we have to be careful that we don't, again, couple that and pack it under systems of capitalism. Particularly, this leads to land grabs under nature-based solutions. For centuries, our lands and territories as Indigenous peoples have been sought to extract the oil, mine minerals, cut down trees, and now they're seeking our lands to store the carbon pollution these processes have created to address the climate crisis that they're responsible for. Again, land theft from our communities. And I want to wrap things up with a really, really good and provocative quote. When I was at Bioneers Conference a few weeks ago, Nick Estes, who's a Native American scholar and activist on climate and Indigenous rights, was asked the question, can't we just tweak capitalism and these systems in order to work for both communities and the climate under sort of sustainable economics? And he said, listen, capitalism has really affected our communities in some of the most negative ways, and we can't just wake up tomorrow and hug the murder out of capitalism. What he's saying is we can't fix these systems in the ways that we want to, and we have to be willing to deconstruct them to make room for more.
Thank you so much, Eriel. Very provocative and very insightful. So, your last question raised lots of pieces that I think gets to, or your last statement, pardon me, and I really appreciate you separating the indigenizing, decolonizing, and all the different issues and the rounding out of forms of knowledge. It's so cogent. And Catherine, that maybe just, and we only have about 17 minutes left for this whole thing, so appreciate we can't do justice to everyone's range of insights, but would love to hear from you, and I want to go back to Jomo and Romina. How do you think about these kind of senses of empiricization, transition, broadening of the narrative to accelerate in the way that you were calling for to get the structural change, at least as you see needed?
So I really want to pick up on one point in particular that Eriel made in their comments, which really links back to the ways in which how we think about what data matters and the influence that what data matters, what we decide which data matters, the influence that that has on the policymaking process, the extent to which those things together limit our imaginations. Because getting to net zero by 2050 requires a huge, tremendous exercise in creative imagining. We need to be willing to, in our minds, break all of the familiar existing systems that we're comfortable with and figure out how to retool them so that we get to a place where we are at zero emissions in 30 years. And to Jomo's point around the risk that net zero by 2050 puts action out, delays action, it is true that we've unfortunately seen agents of the status quo co-opt the concept of net zero by 2050 to mean delayed action. But in fact, if we want to get to zero emissions in 30 years, that means aggressive action every day for the next 30 years, right? Starting yesterday. And so what stops us from taking that level of action? It is the constraints that we have put on ourselves that we need to be breaking free of. And part of how we do that is we change what data counts, but we also change the policy-making machinery that grows out of those initial data inputs. So we've had a very technocratic approach to policymaking on environmental and climate issues for the last 30 years. Again, this kind of tinkering around the edges of an existing system, thinking about climate policies that are exclusively about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and not about achieving a host of other social aims that we should be achieving. And so I think part of what we need to be doing here is retooling our concept of climate policy to say we should be making those social benefits an intentional outcome of climate policy rather than an incidental outcome of climate policy. It shouldn't be an accident that a climate policy results in cleaner air. That should be part of the intention. It shouldn't be an accident that a climate policy makes our communities easier to move around, makes our home more comfortable to live in. That should be the objective of climate policy. And I think what we're saying here is that it should also be the objective of climate policy to correct some of the inequalities, injustices, and violences that are currently baked into our economic and social systems. And that means necessarily unpacking the corporatization of climate solutions that, again, I think Jomo and Eriel have done a really good job pointing out, and bringing it back to the people, bringing it back to that community level action and benefit that has to be at the heart of climate policy if it's going to be sustainable in this giant 30-year visionary project that we have agreed to undertake in this country. And so I think for me, maybe just to end it with a personal story, as an Atlantic Canadian, something that I said about the recent approval of the Bay du Nord offshore oil project in Newfoundland was that it hurt my heart that we didn't have the imagination to think beyond a fossil fuel project as to create opportunities in an area of the country that is desperately in need of opportunities. Where is the big wind project to take advantage of Newfoundland's incredible wind power, rather than resorting always to what we know, which is fossil fuels, which is not going to be carrying us forward into a future that is inhabitable for us or younger generations. So I think that's really the challenge that we need to put on the table here. How do we unlock ourselves from these things that are constraining our ability to imagine?
Maybe just to go to Jomo and Romina, I don't usually like to go the same order twice in a row, but I think the sequence is quite natural here in terms of Jomo. We just heard this range of, and I think you and I in past lives have been in exactly some of these debates on which issues are kind of neutral standard and which issues can only be taken on through local action, which issues will only succeed if the two are bridged. How do we think differently about the urgency that you yourself raised? I think everyone's drawing attention to it. Catherine, the only maybe tweak I would flag editorializing is, I don't know if Canada has yet agreed to a massive urgent social action on this as an entire society. I feel like there's a growing desire among many, but I don't know if it's an agreement to do all of what's needed, because many people still don't know. So I'm curious, Jomo, but maybe just as a non-Canadian who has seen so many countries grapple with things, how do you suggest people think about possibilities and even urgencies in this space?
I'm not sure I'm in a terribly good position to deal with some of these issues from a northern perspective at this stage. But I would like to go back to a point which Eriel made, and that's the whole question of decolonizing. You see, much of the discussion on climate and acting on climate is unfortunately still very much framed by those colonial and post-colonial or neo-colonial relationships. I've just come back about 2 hours ago from a discussion with some of my colleagues who were recently working with the government of a Francophone West African country. And they were complaining that the range of options available were largely being determined by in this case, French government, French corporations, which were active and in offering these solutions. You may remember, John, that about 14 years ago, just before and just after the global financial crisis, some of us were proposing a global Green New Deal. And the global Green New Deal at that time recognized that it was largely the developed countries in Europe and elsewhere who had developed some of the best technologies as far as renewables were concerned. So we saw a possibility of developing a greener future with developed countries being able to produce many of those technologies and developing countries being able to benefit, to leapfrog, bypass a fossil fuel stage of energy generation and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, 14 years later, some of those options are no longer available. I recently looked at the figures, for example, on photovoltaic solar panels. 71% is being produced by China, 7% by Korea, and another 7% by Malaysia. Now, and there's very little interest because China is being discouraged from exporting, particularly to Western countries, and Korea has some difficulties likewise. We see that the only country which is significantly exporting is Malaysia. But at the same time, there is not enough pressure on the Malaysian government to move away from it was previously generating primarily using diesel. Today, it's using coal, and dirty coal at that, because it is much more cheaply available. There is no discouraging coming from the international community as far as this is concerned. it is understandable that many developing countries who are already heavily indebted and have become more indebted in recent years are very disinclined to go into further debt to handle many of these problems. So you really need a comprehensive approach, and that's why I speak of a New Deal, but not a New Deal of the 1930s, but one which recognizes the contemporary realities. We cannot have a situation as we recently had in Sri Lanka, where because Sri Lanka has a foreign exchange problem, it suddenly declares that it wants to promote organic agriculture because it can no longer afford to import fertilizers. But what are we doing now? The major producer of fertilizers in the world are countries such as Russia and Belarus. By basically not only blocking exports of Russian wheat, we have the increased price of wheat, but we also are preventing many countries from importing fertilizers, which will be absolutely necessary for them to maintain productivity. And this will basically condemn them to get into situations of food insecurity. So I think all these issues are really quite intimately entangled, and we cannot find solutions which do not address not only climate, but the range of other developmental problems developing countries face. And the current relations, which are basically essentially neo-colonial, are not conducive to lasting solutions which will really address the problems. And that's why we really need a strong leadership. And unfortunately, that leadership is wanting. That leadership has we've never seen Western countries, many of which are members of the OECD and so on, be so successfully mobilized around increasing military expenditure. Germany has tripled its commitment to military expenditure, but we do not see anything comparable in terms of ODA on the part of the Germans, nor do we see anything comparable in terms of helping to finance mitigation as well as adaptation measures in response to global warming. So we have, unfortunately, a lack of willingness on the part of the countries most responsible for accelerating global warming in terms of addressing these problems. And I'm really quite, as you can tell from my tone, I'm really despair about how we are going to move forward from the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jomo. I think the fiscal response to the pandemic and to the war in Ukraine shows what countries can do when they want to mobilize resources quickly. And so that's part of the brass tacks challenge in the backdrop here, I would argue, but again, others will have their own views. We only have about 2 minutes left. Romina, sorry to put you on the hot seat, but just wondering if you wanted to add anything on this from, especially the link between the inclusive, sustainable development. Even the SDGs are meant to be this multidimensional measure of societal progress, of which climate is one piece. How do you recommend that Canadians who are on the line today and around the world think about threading this needle to bring them together?
Yeah, well, so I think one of the beauty of the SDGs is that it's really sort of comes with an integrated framework, but that also involves a lot of complexity. So one of the issues where we're trying sort of to handle is sort of if you have to give sort of a piece of advice, to countries in terms of how they can accelerate sort of the progress overall on SDGs. What is that we should tell them to do? And I think the sort of analytical answer to that question is actually to invest more in social protection systems, and that proves to be positive on a number of grounds. So obviously on in terms of no leaving people behind and reducing inequalities, but also obviously in creating sort of the foundations for some more inclusive growth. But that can't be the only answer. I mean, when we're talking about climate change, obviously we're talking about other type of actions as well. The final perhaps point I wanted to add is, and I think it was already what others said, is the importance of involving communities. And so which is something else. So now I'm trying to sort of take a sort of a global governance perspective in this, and it's still, I think, my observation that even if a lot has been done, in various sort of global fora to sort of, specifically sort of have some consultative instance where we can bring in sort of the youth, the ones, the women, and the sort of the various, again, underrepresented communities. This is great in the sense that we are able to sort of use those platforms to convey their voices, but we would want those voices actually to shape the debate in a much more fundamental manner, and I think also to finally shape the decisions that are taken at global level. And I think that is where we still see there is a very big sort of blind spot, a big gap, and if so, I think nationally, typically with each of us is very good at, and even locally, at bringing people in. But at global level, I'm not sure this is sort of done well enough. And so that's, if I have perhaps a conclusion to make, or recommendation to make, is really sort of that, again, global governance level, to find a very powerful way to connect, to people and to communities, and again, make sure that their views are informing decisions.
Thank you so much, Romina. I'm afraid we have to adjourn. We're already at time, but we could go on for hours, I'm sure. And we've had a lot of, Eriel has shared a lot of great documents in the chat. I think Katrine's made some great points there too. Let me just thank Policy Horizons. More than anything, thank Romina, Catherine, Jomo, and Eriel for so many important points for forcing all of us to think better, harder every day on all these issues, and for driving so much for action. So really grateful. The urgency is huge. The need to unpack assumptions is even bigger. And that's why Policy Horizons is here. Over to Christella's to force us to think better, harder about steps that need to be taken right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, merci.
Miigwech, merci. Thank you so much, John, Eriel, Catherine, Romina, and Jomo, to be with us here today. It's quite striking how, as you said, everything is so heavily connected, but how important it is to get the balance right between sustainable development, net zero objectives, and also making sure that it's inclusive. And so very collective visioning is going to be required at all levels. So thank you again for being with us. It has been very informative, and we will certainly continue the conversation.
To learn more about Foresight and read our latest reports, please visit horizons.gc.ca.